The man had a rifle, and he had me cornered against a blowdown pile twice my height, and he was close enough that missing was not a realistic option for either of us. That was the situation at approximately 2:15 in the afternoon on a Wednesday in October of 2003 in a section of the Hoh River Valley that most people in Jefferson County had never set foot in and probably never would. I was 43 years old, I had my sidearm, and I was calculating odds that I did not like. And then the forest did something that ended the calculation entirely. Not me, not the man with the rifle, the forest. That is the part I have never been able to adequately explain to a single living person, and it is the reason I am sitting here 22 years later finally putting it into words. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from and if you've had an encounter like this. My name is Dale Whitaker. I spent 30 years with the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office in Port Townsend, Washington, starting as a patrol deputy in 1985 and finishing as a senior investigator before I retired in 2015. For about 20 of those years, I also volunteered with the Jefferson County Search and Rescue Unit, which meant that a significant portion of my off-duty hours were spent in the mountains and forests of the Olympic Peninsula, looking for people who were lost or injured, or in the worst cases, neither lost nor injured, but simply dead in a place where the terrain had made a final and irrevocable decision for them. I am telling you this not to establish credentials in the way that seems impressive on paper, but because I want you to understand what kind of relationship I had with the Olympic backcountry before any of this began. It was not a recreational relationship, it was working familiarity, the kind you develop when a place has tested you repeatedly and you have come to understand its rules and its moods as you understand the moods of a colleague you have worked beside for years. I respected that forest. I knew what it could do, and I knew, the way any working professional in the Pacific Northwest knows, that stories about Sasquatch were exactly that, stories, campfire material, the kind of thing tourists asked about and locals smiled at and nobody with a badge took seriously. I was one of those people. What I did not know, not until the fall of 2002, was what was living in it. The Olympic Peninsula sits at the northwestern corner of Washington state, jutting out into the Pacific like a fist, bounded on 3 sides by water and on the 4th by Hood Canal and the cities of the eastern shore. The interior of the peninsula is dominated by Olympic National Park, which encompasses over 900,000 acres of land ranging from Pacific coastline to subalpine meadows to some of the most striking temperate rainforests on the planet. The Hoh rainforest is the most famous of these, a stretch of the Hoh River Valley that receives between 140 and 170 inches of rain every year and produces trees that have to be seen to be believed. Sitka spruce with trunks 12 feet across, western red cedars that were saplings when the Mayflower crossed the Atlantic, big-leaf maples so draped in club moss and licorice fern that the branches look upholstered in green in summer. The understory is sword fern and oxalis and hemlock seedlings and fallen logs so thick with moss that you can push your hand 6 inches into the surface before hitting wood. The place has a smell that I have never encountered anywhere else, a dense, layered combination of decomposing vegetation and wet bark and living soil that is almost edible in its richness. I grew up in Port Angeles, about 40 miles north of the Hoh Valley as the crow flies, and my father took me into those woods for the first time when I was 8 years old. He was a deer hunter, not a Hoh Valley man, but occasionally he ranged south for Roosevelt elk, which the peninsula holds in one of the largest concentrations anywhere in the Pacific Northwest. I spent enough Novembers in the timber as a teenager that I learned the rain before I could see it, learned the particular quality of the light under those clouds that tells you the temperature is going to drop fast, learned the difference between a branch cracking from weight and a branch cracking from weight moving through. By the time I joined the sheriff's office, the Olympic backcountry was as familiar to me as the hallways of my own house, and that familiarity was a tool I used constantly in the SAR work. I knew which drainages flooded fast and which creek beds held firm underfoot. I knew where the elk trails ran and how to use them for speed when a grid search was taking too long. I knew the places where people who got turned around in the forest tended to drift, the natural funnels and open corridors that a disoriented human would unconsciously follow. And I knew the places where they tended not to drift, the sections of heavy timber and steep ground that the forest essentially walled off from casual entry. The first time I noticed anything unusual was in late October of 2002. We had a search going for a day hiker who had gone missing off the Hoh River Trail, a 47-year-old school teacher from Olympia named Glenn Barnes, who had signed in at the Hoh Rainforest Visitor Center on a Tuesday and had not returned to his car by Thursday evening. The trail runs roughly 17 miles from the visitor center to Glacier Meadows at the base of Mount Olympus, and Glenn had told the ranger at the desk that he was planning to walk in about 6 miles to a campsite near the river bend and come back the next day. 2 days was too long to be sitting at a campsite by choice. We went looking for him. I was running one of 3 teams working the valley floor on that Friday afternoon, covering the section of trail between miles 4 and 7. My team consisted of me, a volunteer named Phil Norris, who had been doing SAR work since before I joined, and a woman named Carol Sayers, who worked dispatch at the sheriff's office and volunteered on weekends when a search had enough scope to warrant her. Phil was on point. Carol was navigating the secondary track that ran between the river and the tree line, and I was working the edge of the old-growth timber on the uphill side of the trail. The forest in that section is old growth at the margins and transitions quickly into the dark, heavy stand of spruce and cedar that keeps the sky almost entirely out. In late October, with the rain coming down and the light already flattening by 3 in the afternoon, that kind of timber is genuinely difficult to see into for more than 20 feet. At approximately mile 5.5, I noticed that the Roosevelt elk herd we had been paralleling for the past 40 minutes had stopped, not bedded down, not grazing, stopped and oriented, all of them facing the same direction into the trees upslope from the trail, with their ears canted forward and their bodies tensed in the particular way that elk telegraph a presence they have not yet identified as safe or dangerous. I have watched elk behave around cougars, around bears, around groups of hikers, around logging equipment. Each situation produces a specific behavioral signature. This one did not match any of them. The herd held its position for about 3 minutes without moving, and then the lead cow took 2 steps backward and turned and walked the herd steadily downstream, not running, not panicking, but leaving, with a deliberateness that communicated that whatever was upslope of us had made a decision for them. I called a pause on the radio and stood at the tree line looking into the timber. I could not see anything. The Sitka spruce in that section grows so close together, and the understory is so thick with salal and sword fern that the visual depth is maybe 30 feet in good light. In October rain, it was closer to 15. I scanned for about 2 minutes, heard nothing unusual, and marked the location on my GPS before calling the team back to movement. We found Glenn Barnes about a half-mile further along the trail, sitting on a log with a badly twisted ankle and a dead radio battery, embarrassed and cold and absolutely fine. We splinted his ankle, got him moving on a walking pole, and had him back at the visitor center before dark.
Quick thing before we get into it. I have a book coming out. It's called the Bigfoot Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. It's kind of my baby. So if you want to check it out, links down below. Now let's get you back to the video.
On the drive back to Port Townsend, I mentioned the elk behavior to Phil. He was quiet for a moment and then said he had heard the same from a ranger he knew who worked the Hoh corridor regularly, heard behavior that didn't fit any of the standard causes. I put it in the back of my mind and forgot about it for about 3 months. In February of 2003, we had another search in the valley. This one was a more serious situation, a backcountry skier who had gone off trail at the upper end of the snow dome drainage and triggered a small slide that buried his pack and his snowshoes. He was recovered alive after an overnight stay that was brutal but survivable. During the search on the second day, I was working to transect through the lower timber below the snow line when I found a set of tracks in the mud at the edge of a creek drainage. Not boot tracks, bare foot tracks, but far too large to belong to any person. The prints were pressed deep, indicating significant weight, and the stride length was over 5 feet. I measured the tracks using the folded reference card I carry in every kit, and the longest print was 19.5 inches from heel to toe. At the widest point across the ball, it was 8 inches. I photographed them on the digital camera I had started carrying on searches after the department switched from film in 2001. I took 8 photos from different angles, using a pen for scale. I stood there in the rain looking at those prints and running through the standard explanations. A bear walking in an unusual bipedal posture, possible in theory, but bears in bipedal movement leave a very different track profile, the rear legs swinging out and landing wide, and the plantar structures completely different from what I was looking at. These prints had human foot geometry, 5 toes visible, a heel, an arch that was low but present, and a pressure pattern consistent with a normal bipedal walking gait. They were not a bear, they were not a deer. They were not any other animal I had tracked in 30 years of moving through Pacific Northwest wilderness. I did not tell anyone at the time. I took my photos and I continued my transect, and I found the toe of the skier's bury site about 400 meters further up the drainage, and that occupied the rest of my day and most of my thinking for the week that followed. The Monday after the search, I went back to the office and did something I have thought about many times since. I sat at my desk, opened the case management system, and began typing a supplemental observation report. I got as far as the date field and the location field, and then I stopped. I sat there with my fingers on the keyboard for what was probably 2 full minutes, staring at the blank lines on the screen, and then I closed the program without saving anything. I told myself I needed more documentation before filing. I told myself a photograph and a field measurement were not sufficient to support a formal report on their own. Both of those things were true. They were also not the real reason I closed the screen. The real reason was that I knew exactly how that document would travel. I had been in law enforcement long enough to understand where a formal report describing outsized bipedal tracks in an Olympic National Park drainage would land and what would happen to the person whose name was at the top of it. I had watched colleagues file reports on anomalous observations before. Not Bigfoot, nothing remotely like this, but discrepancies in physical evidence, witness accounts that didn't square with the established record, things that sat outside the expected pattern, and I had watched how those reports were received. They went into subcategories that received no further attention, and the person who filed them was quietly noted as someone whose judgment needed monitoring. I was not willing to be that person. Not for a set of tracks I could not yet explain to myself, let alone to a supervisor who had a caseload and a budget and no patience for the kind of problem that couldn't be resolved by Friday. But the photos stayed on my camera, and I kept coming back to them in the evenings, sitting at my kitchen table in Port Townsend with a beer and my reading glasses, zooming in on the screen until the resolution broke into pixels, trying to find the explanation that would make the prints ordinary. I never found it. My wife Karen noticed I was distracted. She was a high school biology teacher who had spent her career trying to get teenagers interested in the natural world, and she had a scientist's patience for anomalous data and a very low tolerance for my habit of working problems alone instead of talking through them. One evening she sat down across from me while I was staring at the camera screen and said, "Show me what you're looking at." I turned the camera toward her. She studied the image for a long time. Then she looked up. "That's a big print. 19.5 inches, I told her. She was quiet for a moment, and then, "You're not going to be able to let this go, are you?" It was not a question. Karen was right. I was not going to let it go, and I did not. Over the spring and summer of 2003, I started treating my SAR shifts in the Hoh drainage as a secondary research project alongside the primary mission. Every time I was in that valley, I was paying attention to 2 things at once: the search at hand and the environment around it. I started keeping a separate field notebook, a small, waterproof write in the rain pad that I kept in the breast pocket of my rain jacket, and every time I noticed something that fell outside the ordinary, I documented it. Location, time, weather conditions, a description of what I observed. The list grew. In April, I found a tree structure about 200 meters off the main trail near mile 8, not a blowdown, not a beaver work, a deliberate arrangement of fallen timber. 3 large Sitka spruce trunks leaned together in a rough tripod configuration with smaller branches woven between them in a pattern that created a sheltered space underneath. I have seen trail crew work, and I have seen illegal camp construction, and I have seen the things that windstorms do to timber, and this was none of those. The branches were not sawed or chopped. They were twisted and broken at a force well beyond what any person could apply to a branch of that diameter. The lower ends of the main trunks were not in the ground. They were sitting on the forest floor, balanced, held in position by their own weight and the interlocking of the smaller material. Whatever built it had not needed tools. It had used its hands. In June, during a grid search for a missing child who was ultimately found safe at a neighbor's house 3 miles from the search area, one of the other searchers, a volunteer named Mark Reed, pulled me aside and showed me a depression in the soft ground near the river. It was oval, approximately 8 feet long and 4 feet wide, with the vegetation pressed flat in a consistent direction, and the edges compressed deeply enough into the ground that Mark had measured the depth at just over 2 inches. The smell in and around the depression was distinctive, a musky animal odor that was not bear and was not elk and was not any other local fauna I could identify. It smelled old, like a living thing that had been lying there recently, and it smelled warm the way an animal's resting place retains the heat signature of its body for a period after it moves. Mark called it a big nest. I wrote it in my notebook and moved on. By August of 2003, I had 11 separate entries in the notebook. 5 involving tracks of varying sizes, 2 involving tree structures, 2 involving the elongated ground depressions, 1 involving a series of wood knocks that I heard across the river during an early morning search and that I initially attributed to trail crew before remembering that there was no scheduled crew work that day, and 1 that I have kept for last because it is the one that changed the character of everything that came before it. On August 19, 2003, I was doing a solo pre-search reconnaissance of a section of trail that the trail crew had reported as damaged by a slide from the previous week's storm. My job was to walk in and assess whether the slide had blocked the trail enough to require rerouting and whether the damage to the drainage above the slide zone posed any additional risk to searchers or hikers. It was a Tuesday, a clear day after 10 days of rain, and the valley was doing that thing it does after extended rain, steaming slightly in the morning sun as moisture evaporated from the moss and the bark and the standing water in the fern hollows. The light had that green gold quality that only exists in old growth after rain, and the smell was its own form of overwhelming. The particular concentration of rot and growth that the Hoh produces when the temperature rises after a wet stretch. I was at approximately mile 9.5 when I heard a vocalization that stopped me on the trail. Not a bird, not an elk, not the wind in the canopy which has its own pitch and rhythm that I know as well as a song I've heard 10,000 times. This was a sound produced by a chest, by respiratory structures, by a body, by something alive that was using its voice. It was low, sustained, and it had a quality I can only describe as directional intent, meaning it felt like it was aimed at something specific rather than being a general, territorial, or distress call. It lasted approximately 5 seconds, then stopped. About 20 seconds later, from further upslope and to the north, a nearly identical sound answered it. Same pitch profile, same duration, with a variation in the final 2 seconds that suggested a response rather than an echo. I stood on the trail and did not move for a very long time. My field experience told me I was hearing a call and response pattern between 2 individuals of the same species. My experience in the Olympic backcountry told me there was no native species in these mountains that produced a vocalization at that frequency with that kind of deliberate patterning. Black bears vocalize, but their sounds do not have that quality of structured exchange. Mountain lions produce sounds that would raise every hair on your body, but they do not produce sustained tonal calls in conversation with each other at distances of several hundred meters. Roosevelt elk produce low calls during the rut, but this was August and the rut does not start until September, and the sound was wrong in every way that matters. I recorded 4 minutes of audio on my radio's handset before the sound stopped. When I played it back that evening, Karen listened for a long time without speaking. Then she said quietly, "Dale, you need to be careful." I told her, "I'm always careful." She said, "That's not what I mean." She meant she believed me, and she was afraid of what I was going to do next because she knew me well enough to know that I was going to go back in there. She was right again. What I did not know in August of 2003, what I would not learn until the following spring, was that I was not the first person to notice what was in that section of the Hoh Valley. The Park Service has a long institutional memory for certain things, the kind of memory that is maintained not in official documents, but in the informal briefings that experienced rangers give to new rangers before they start work in the Hoh corridor. At some point that fall, after I had submitted my trail damage assessment to the county and the Park Service, I had a conversation with a ranger named Tom Brower who had been working the Hoh since the early 90s. He told me very quietly and very specifically that there was a section of the valley between mile 8 and mile 12 that generated a pattern of reports that the Hoh staff had been tracking informally for years. Hikers who came back describing sounds they couldn't identify. A few who mentioned seeing something large and upright at the tree line at dusk. One trail crew member who had quit after a week on a project in that section and refused to say why. Tom told me that the park's position was that these reports were attributable to wildlife, to the acoustic properties of the valley, to the psychological effects of deep wilderness on people who were not accustomed to it. He told me this while looking at me with an expression that suggested he was reading from a script he found personally unconvincing. I asked him what his own position was. He looked at his coffee for a while, then he said, "I've worked the Hoh for 11 years. I know every sound this valley makes." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. We both understood what the unfinished end of it contained. It was in October of 2003, 3 weeks after that conversation with Tom, that the situation I described at the start of this account came to a head. I want to build toward it properly because the events of that afternoon cannot be understood without the context of what I encountered first, the context that changed every calculation I was making about what was in those trees and what it was capable of. We had received, through the Park Services Coordination Office, a report from a backcountry permittee who had come out of the Hoh corridor after an 8-day trip and described a disturbing encounter. He had been camped at a designated site near mile 11 when, on his 5th night, he had discovered that his food cache had been raided, not by a bear. He was specific about this and was experienced enough to make the distinction. His bear canister, a heavy polycarbonate container rated to resist 300 pounds of sustained force, had been opened. Not broken, not cracked, not pried apart. Opened in the sense that the locking mechanism had been disengaged. The permittee, a man named Robert Strand, who was an experienced backcountry traveler from Seattle, said the canister's locking collar required a specific rotational motion to disengage, a motion that his research suggested no bear could perform due to the opposing thumb mechanics required. The food inside had been removed and the canister had been placed upright on a log, approximately 10 feet from where he had hung it from a bear wire. He had found it in the morning. He had also found in the mud below the bear wire footprints. The footprints from Robert's account matched what I had measured in February. He had photographed them, and when I reviewed his photos alongside mine, the track characteristics were consistent enough that I was fairly confident they came from the same individual or the same population. The same general print geometry, the same stride pattern, the same depth of impression, suggesting a weight between 400 and 600 pounds based on soil displacement calculations I had been doing roughly in my head and then more precisely after reading a study on track analysis in my university's digital library. Robert Strand had also described something that I cannot write off as coincidence or misinterpretation given everything else I had already documented. After he discovered the raided canister and the tracks, he spent the day at his campsite trying to decide whether to exit early. He chose to stay partly because the weather had closed in and partly because he had planned his route carefully and felt his campsite was defensible and that whatever had taken his food was probably not interested in him directly. That evening after dark, he heard sounds from the timber on the upslope side of his camp. Not threatening sounds, he said, no sounds of approach with aggressive intent, rhythmic sounds, low frequency, almost musical in their patterning. They lasted about 45 minutes and then stopped, he wrote, and that after they stopped, he fell asleep easily, which struck him as strange in retrospect because he was a man who had trouble sleeping in the backcountry under normal circumstances. His written report described them as the most calming thing I have ever heard in 30 years of wilderness travel and the most completely beyond my experience. I read Robert Strand's report 3 times. I had heard similar sounds on my recorder in August. I had a growing body of physical evidence, the tracks, the structures, the ground depressions pointing to something large, intelligent, and apparently habituated to the presence of humans in this section of the valley to the degree that it was not withdrawing from us, but was instead moving around us, observing from distances that kept it out of easy visual range without requiring it to leave the area entirely. I had a ranger with 11 years on the Hoh corridor who had stopped a sentence short of telling me directly what he believed. and I had a solid and growing conviction that whatever was in these mountains did not warrant the kind of fear, not to the degree that the forest's actual dangers warranted fear, but was instead something that deserved the same careful, patient respect I had learned to give to any wild thing that was minding its own business in its own territory. And then on October 8th, 2003, everything I thought I understood about the situation in that valley became a secondary problem. The call came in through Park Service coordination at 7:45 in the morning. A volunteer trail crew member working on a brushing project at Mile 6 had found evidence of a camp on an illegal site about 150 meters off trail, upslope toward the timber edge. Not a backpacker's camp. A camp that had been occupied by the scale and permanence of what the crew member described for an extended period. A lean-to construction of branches and bark, a fire pit with ash from many fires, food storage cache made from plastic bins that had been carried in from outside, what appeared to be a tarp-wrapped bundle of supplies. And most significantly, the crew member noted signs of recent habitation, including a fire that had been active within the previous day or two. Illegal camping in Olympic National Park is a citation matter in most cases, the kind of thing that generates a report and a fine and no further incident. But a semi-permanent encampment occupied over an extended period was different. And the detail about the fire pit with its accumulated ash history, combined with the presence of a substantial supply cache, suggested someone who had been living in the backcountry not as a recreational choice but as a permanent one. That combination, when processed through my 20 years of law enforcement experience, produced a reading that I did not like. People who disappear into the backcountry with supply caches and live there for extended periods without filing any permit or notifying anyone of their presence are in one of a small number of categories, and most of those categories involve reasons for being invisible that are not good reasons. I drove to the Hoh Rainforest Visitor Center that morning, coordinated briefly with the Park Service's law enforcement ranger, a woman named Janet Flores, who I had worked with before on a couple of complicated situations in the park, and then went in on foot with my pack. Janet was going to follow at a distance with backup once she finished coordinating with the county. The plan was for me to do a preliminary look at the site and assess the situation before anyone else went in. This was not unusual protocol for a situation of this type, where a heavy law enforcement presence at the outset could escalate a confrontation that might otherwise resolve quietly. What I did not anticipate, and what I should have anticipated because my experience of the Olympic backcountry should have taught me better, was the degree to which the terrain around that particular section of the Hoh Valley can mask both sound and presence. I walked in from the visitor center at a pace I would describe as deliberate but not cautious. I had my pack, my sidearm under my jacket, my radio on low volume clipped to my shoulder. The trail in that section was dry by Hoh standards, meaning there was only an inch of standing water in the low spots rather than 3, and the October light was doing what October light does in that valley, coming through the canopy at a low angle that made the moss on the cedar trunks glow an impossible orange gold and laid long shadows across the trail that could swallow a standing person whole if you weren't looking directly at them. I was paying attention to the forest above the trail rather than the trail itself, which was how I usually moved in the Hoh on a solo entry, scanning the understory and the lower canopy for movement patterns that didn't fit the wind. I found the camp without difficulty. The crew members' GPS coordinates were accurate to within about 10 meters, and the trail leading to it, while off route, had been used enough times that the vegetation was showing the compression of repeated foot traffic. The camp itself was better organized than I had expected, not the improvised setup of someone who had fled into the woods in a panic, but the methodical arrangement of someone who had planned extensively and then executed the plan over a period of months. The lean-to was positioned to shed rain efficiently. The fire pit had a flat stone windbreak on the uphill side, and the storage cache was elevated on a platform of lashed poles that kept it dry and off the ground. Whoever had built this knew what they were doing, and they had been here long enough to keep improving it. The timber in that area is so dense and the understory so thick that a person moving carefully can close 20 meters in absolute silence if they know what they're doing. And the person who had been living in that camp for what turned out to be approximately 4 months had developed a very precise knowledge of the terrain immediately around his position. His name, which I did not learn until the following spring when the investigation concluded, was Donald Webb. He was 49 years old from Tacoma, and he had driven off the road he was supposed to be on in the spring of 2003, involving a warrant for aggravated assault in Pierce County and a very clear motive for not being found. I did not know any of this when I located his camp and began assessing the site. I knew only what I could see, which was a well-established illegal encampment that showed evidence of careful, sustained planning by someone who intended to be there for a long time and did not want visitors. I was photographing the supply cache when I heard him move behind me. I turned, and he was standing at the edge of the camp about 15 feet away, and he was holding a rifle. A Ruger bolt action, I noticed, because that is the kind of detail that your brain locks onto in that kind of situation. He was bearded and gaunt in the way that people get when they've been eating only what the land provides for months at a stretch, with the particular clarity of eye that extended wilderness living produces. He was not panicking. He was calculating, and the calculation he was running was visible in how he held the rifle, which was at port arms, not pointed at me, but ready to become pointed at me faster than I could close the 15 feet between us. I identified myself clearly and told him I was with the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office. I kept my hands visible and my voice level. He told me, in a voice that was surprisingly calm given the circumstances, that I needed to leave. I told him that was not going to be the resolution to this situation. He said it was the only resolution he was prepared to accept. The 15 feet between us felt like no distance at all. I was wearing my jacket with my sidearm underneath it, and the process of going from hand visible to armed was going to require a motion that would give him time to respond before I could complete it. I was working the problem quickly, looking for angles and options. He backed me toward the blowdown pile I mentioned at the start of this account, not by advancing on me aggressively, but by holding his position and letting the geometry of the clearing dictate where I had to step. In about 30 seconds, I had a wall of root ball and dead timber behind me that went up to about 12 feet, and the only clear direction was the one he was blocking, and the rifle was no longer at port arms. I have been in dangerous situations before. 20 years of law enforcement includes moments that reduce your options to bad and worse. I have always been able to find a third path by staying calm and thinking clearly, and I was trying to do that, genuinely trying, and I was not finding it. The man in front of me had made a decision, and the specific quality of that decision was visible in how his breathing had changed, becoming slower and more deliberate, which is what some people do when they are past the point of negotiation. What happened next took approximately 4 seconds and has occupied a significant portion of my thinking for the past 22 years. The forest behind Donald Webb went quiet. Not the gradual quiet of animals clearing an area as a threat approaches. Instantaneous. The birdsong stopped, the wind-driven movement in the canopy stopped, the small drip and settle sounds of a rainforest after a recent wet spell simply ceased. The silence was not the absence of sound. It was a pressure, a weight in the air that I felt in my ears and in my sternum like a bass note from a speaker that's large enough. Donald Webb felt it too. I watched his body language change in real time. The deliberate focus that had been directed entirely at me broke. His eyes moved, not to the right or the left, up and behind him toward the tree line at the far edge of the camp clearing, which was about 40 feet behind his position. I did not look away from him, but in my peripheral vision, at the edge of the tree line, I registered a shape, upright, still, dark, the kind of dark that is not shadow, but density, a mass of material that absorbed rather than reflected the light coming through the canopy. I could not resolve the details in peripheral vision. What I could resolve was the scale of it, and the scale was wrong for any human and wrong for any animal I had ever stood in the presence of. The highest part of the shape, which was the top of what I could only interpret as a head, was at or above the level of the lowest branches of the spruce at that tree line, and those branches were at least 9 feet off the ground. Donald Webb took a step backward, not toward me, away from the tree line. He took another step. The rifle came down from its ready position, not dropped but lowered, his arms losing the tension that had been in them 30 seconds before. His face, which I could now see clearly because he was facing me and the light was adequate, had changed from the focus calculation of before to something that I can only describe as a person encountering a context they do not have a framework to process. It was not fear exactly, though fear was in it. It was the expression of someone whose model of reality has just been presented with information that does not fit the model, and whose nervous system is responding to that mismatch faster than their conscious mind can catch up. He looked at me once, a quick, reflexive glance that seemed almost involuntary, as if he was checking whether I was registering what he was registering. I was. Whatever passed between us in that look was not communication exactly, but acknowledgement. Two people recognizing at the same instant that something had entered their situation that outweighed the problem they had been in the middle of. Then Donald Webb turned and walked fast into the timber on the opposite side of the clearing from the tree line, not running, walking at the pace of a man who is fully committed to not being where he is currently standing, but who has not broken into flight, because breaking into flight would require acknowledging that what was behind him warranted flight. He was maintaining the specific kind of composure that is actually terror held very tightly inside a very rigid posture, and I watched him walk between two spruce trunks and disappear into the understory, and I never saw him again. I stood against the blowdown pile. My back was against the root ball. My sidearm was in my hand, which I had managed to draw in the moment Webb's attention broke from me. I lowered it and held still and looked at the tree line. The shape was gone. I don't know when it left. In the 2 or 3 seconds that I spent watching Webb withdraw, whatever had been at that tree line had moved back into the timber without my seeing it happen. I stood at that blowdown pile for what was probably 90 seconds, scanning the full perimeter of the clearing, listening to the forest come back to life around me, the birds first, and then the small ticking and dripping sounds. And I understood two things clearly. The first was that I was alive because something at that tree line had decided I should be, and had communicated that decision to Donald Webb through presence alone, through the sheer fact of standing there and being what it was, and that was sufficient. The second was that whatever I filed in my report about what had happened in that clearing was going to determine how this played out for both of us, the man who had just walked away and the thing that had walked away first. I chose my words carefully when Janet Flores came into the camp 40 minutes later and found me sitting on a log with my field notebook in my hands. I told her the subject had left the camp before I arrived and that I had done a sweep of the perimeter without contact. She accepted this. It was technically accurate the way certain statements are technically accurate while leaving out the part that would change everything. I am a 20-year law enforcement officer, and I have never filed a false report, and I am not comfortable with what I did in those 40 minutes. But I also cannot honestly say I would do it differently. What I would have written in a truthful account was not something that had a home in any official document in any law enforcement agency in the country, and writing it would not have helped find Donald Webb or served any legitimate law enforcement purpose. What it would have done is attach my name permanently to a claim that would have defined the rest of my career and my retirement in ways I was not willing to accept. So I did what people in impossible situations often do. I told the part of the truth that fit into the available containers and left the rest of it in the forest where it belonged. The investigation into Donald Webb's illegal encampment went forward without my full account. The Park Service documented the camp, collected the evidence, and eventually, the following April, Webb was located by Pierce County detectives at a motel in Shelton after being turned in by a woman he had contacted through a church food bank. He was charged on the original assault warrant, served 14 months, and was released in the fall of 2005. I know all of this because I tracked it, because the investigation was partly mine and partly Janet's and partly Pierce County's, and I had access to the coordination updates. I never mentioned the Hoh Valley to any of the detectives. I never included my presence at the camp in any documentation related to his capture. One question kept surfacing in the weeks after October 8th, not the encounter with Webb, though that occupied its share of my thinking. What I could not stop examining was the decision the thing at the tree line had made, because it was a decision. I was there. I watched it happen. Whatever had been standing in that timber had assessed the situation in that clearing, had understood the nature of the threat directed at me, and had intervened with a calculation aimed at resolving the situation without violence. It had not charged into the clearing. It had not made a display at Webb with the kind of physical aggression that something of its size could certainly have produced. It had simply stood at the boundary of the timber and been visible, and it had been visible specifically at the angle and the distance that would put it in Webb's peripheral vision while he was focused on me. That positioning was not accidental. It was chosen. I want to be precise here because precision matters. I am not saying the thing in the forest knew who I was or had made a specific decision to protect me based on any prior relationship. What I am saying is that it had enough behavioral intelligence to read a situation involving two humans in conflict and calculate an intervention that would change the outcome. That is a capability that puts it in a category that I had not previously assigned to it. I had been thinking of it throughout the months of evidence I had been accumulating as a large, shy, intelligent animal. After October 8th, I stopped thinking of it as an animal at all. Over the fall and into the winter, I went back into the valley 6 times, not on official searches, on my own time in my own truck with my field kit and my notebook and the kind of patience that you develop only when you understand that whatever you are trying to approach cannot be rushed. I was not hunting. I was not documenting for publication or for any official purpose. I was, as simply as I can put it, trying to understand what had happened and whether understanding more of it was possible. Karen knew where I was going and why. She had stopped arguing about it after October, which was its own kind of statement. On the first 3 of these visits, I found nothing that I had not found before. Tracks in the appropriate areas, the acoustic signatures, once the smell heavy and musky and warm, in a section of trail that had been rained on recently enough that the smell should have been suppressed. On the 4th visit in early December, I found something I had not expected to find. I had gone into the valley on a Wednesday, taking a personal day from the office, and was working the section around mile 9 when I noticed that the tree structure I had documented in April had been added to. Not dismantled and rebuilt, expanded. 2 additional trunks had been incorporated into the original design, extending the covered area beneath by roughly 30%, and the woven material between the uprights had been supplemented with fresh cedar bark in sections where the original material had degraded from months of rain. Whoever had done this had inspected the existing structure, identified its deficiencies, and addressed them with fresh material. That sequence of assessment and improvement is not instinct, it is problem solving. I took photos of everything and sat beside the structure for about an hour in the December rain, reading the modifications as you read a document someone has left for you. On the 5th visit in late December, I left an offering at the base of the structure. It felt strange while I was doing it, like a gesture whose meaning I was not certain would translate. I left a bundle of dried fruit from a grocery store bag, still in its packaging, set in a waterproof bag and wedged into the base of the primary trunk where it would be protected from rain but easily visible. I did not wait to see what happened. I went home. I came back 9 days later on January 3rd, 2004, and the bundle was gone. In its place was a piece of elk bone, clean and smooth, with 3 parallel grooves cut into one face. The grooves were deliberate. They were made by something sharp, and they were spaced evenly enough that I could not attribute them to random gnawing or weathering. Someone had marked that bone. Whether the marking was decorative or communicative or simply habitual, I cannot say. But it was intentional, and its presence in the location where I had left my offering meant that the exchange had been noticed and acknowledged. I sat with that bone for a long time on the drive home. Karen was in bed when I got back, but she had left the kitchen light on. I put the bone on the kitchen counter and stood there looking at it, and Karen came out in her robe and stood beside me and looked at it too. And after a while, "What are you going to do?" she said. I told her I was going to keep going back. I mean, after that. I did not have an answer. I was not thinking past the next visit. What I did not know yet was that the next significant event in this story was not going to come from me returning to the forest. It was going to come from what the forest sent to me. In the 3rd week of January 2004, I was working an evening shift when the dispatcher sent me to a domestic disturbance call on a rural road about 12 miles east of Forks. Nothing unusual about the call itself. I cleared it in about 90 minutes and was on my way back toward the highway when my headlights caught something on the road shoulder. I thought it was a deer at first. The shape was dark, and it was at the edge of the pavement where deer sometimes feed at night on the grass in the road corridor. But when I slowed and put my spotlight on it, I realized it was not a deer. It was a dead black bear. A large one, 300 pounds at minimum, a boar in excellent condition with a thick winter coat and no obvious signs of vehicle strike damage. I pulled over and examined it with my flashlight. No wounds that I could see externally, no blood on the pavement. The bear was simply lying on its side at the road edge as if it had walked up to the shoulder and lain down and died. I called it in, tagged the location on my MDT, and continued my shift. The following week, Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife picked up the carcass and conducted a necropsy. The cause of death was internal hemorrhaging from blunt force trauma to the thorax, not a vehicle strike. The wound pattern, according to the Fish and Wildlife officer who called me with the results, was consistent with the compressive force applied to the chest from outside, an impact or a sustained squeeze rather than a collision. No prior record of this kind of wound in a bear in this region, and that they had no explanation for it. I wrote the location in my notebook. The road was 12 miles east of Forks, which put it at the northern edge of the Hoh River drainage. The bear had died near the boundary of the territory I had been documenting for the past year. I am not saying I know what killed it. I am saying the location was not a coincidence that I was able to dismiss, and the wound pattern was consistent with the application of force that nothing native to the Olympic Peninsula could produce, except at a scale I had been accumulating evidence for over 14 months. Between the fifth and sixth visits, I took a step that felt both obvious and odd, which was to read everything I could find on the subject I was apparently in the middle of. I had spent 30 years as a law enforcement officer, and my approach to unexplained situations had always been to gather data first and theorize second, and the data I had been gathering needed a framework. I ordered books through the library in Port Townsend, quietly one at a time, not wanting to generate any pattern in the interlibrary loan records that someone might notice. I read accounts from the 1960s and 70s that the scientific establishment had dismissed, looked at track analysis studies, read the published material on the Patterson-Gimlin film from 1967 with fresh eyes. The film was shot in the Bluff Creek drainage in Northern California, which is at the southern end of the same Pacific coastal mountain range that includes the Olympics. The terrain there, the dense mixed forest, the creek drainages, the dense understory, was recognizable to me in the way that all old-growth Pacific Northwest forest is recognizable. I had always filed that film in the category of compelling but unverifiable, the same category as most things that could not be directly tested. After February of 2003, I moved it to a different category. I did not need to resolve the question of whether the film was genuine. I knew from my own field experience what I was dealing with. The film just told me that what I was dealing with was not new, was not confined to the Olympic Peninsula, and was apparently distributed across a range of territory that made its continued existence and its continued anonymity both more explicable and more staggering. Karen read some of what I read, not all of it, but enough that she could follow the conversations we were having at the kitchen table in the evenings. She brought her biology background to the question with a groundedness I found steadying. The genetic proximity between whatever this species was and Homo sapiens was the piece that interested her most, she said, because proximity at that level would explain the behavioral overlaps, the tool use, the social structure, the capacity for exchange that looked very much like communication and intentional exchange. In evolutionary terms, a few 100,000 years of divergence was not very long, she added, and that the behavioral repertoire we were observing was consistent with a species that shared most of our neural architecture, but had developed in a very different environmental context. She offered this as a biologist carefully and without overclaiming, and I have held on to that framing ever since because it was the most useful one anyone ever offered me. In February of 2004, I went back into the valley for the sixth visit since October. The weather had been severe, with snowfall at elevation and sustained rain in the valley floor for most of January. The trail was in poor shape in the lower miles and essentially impassable above mile 7 without snowshoes. I went in with snowshoes and made it to the area around mile 8.5 before the snow depth made further progress impractical. I was turning around when I heard the vocalization again, close, much closer than any of the previous times, maybe 100 meters upslope in the timber, not a call and response this time. A single sustained tone, low and complex, with harmonics that seemed to shift as I stood and listened, the pitch not changing, but its quality modulating to suggest multiple frequency components being generated at once. It lasted perhaps 20 seconds, then silence. I stayed completely still. The snow was coming down lightly, large, soft flakes that made almost no sound on the surface. My breathing was the loudest thing in the immediate environment, and I worked to slow it. I waited for 10 minutes without moving. Then I spoke, not loudly, in a conversational tone directed toward the timber upslope. I said I was not there to harm anything, and I was not there to bring anyone back. I said I came back because of what happened in October, and I was trying to understand. I know how that sounds as a description of what a 43-year-old sheriff's deputy did alone in a snowstorm in the Olympic backcountry in February. I know how it sounds, and I also know that I would do it again. Nothing responded audibly. I turned and started back down the trail. About 20 meters on, I stopped because the hair on the back of my neck had gone up. I turned slowly. At the tree line 50 meters behind me, at the exact point where the old-growth timber began, there was a shape, upright, still. The snow was coming down between us, and the light was flat and gray, and I was looking at it directly, not in peripheral vision as on October 8th, and I could see it. I could see it. And what I saw has lived in me every day for 22 years. She was enormous. I'm using that pronoun not because I could determine sex at that distance in those conditions with certainty, but because the shape of the face and the proportions of the figure, even at 50 meters through falling snow, read to me as female in a way I cannot fully articulate but cannot deny. She stood at the edge of the timber with both arms at her sides and her weight distributed across both feet in the posture of a being that was completely comfortable in its environment and was not troubled by my presence. Her hair was dark, the deep brownish black of wet bark, close and dense across her body and longer on her head and shoulders. Her face, which I was watching carefully now because the light was adequate for detail, at this distance, if you held very still and let your eyes adjust to the gray, was broad across the cheekbones and had a brow ridge that cast her eyes into shadow. But the eyes were visible, they were dark, and they were set in a face that held an expression I have spent 22 years trying to find the right word for. Patient, not the patience of something waiting for a threat to pass, the patience of someone who has time, who understands that the world will unfold at the pace it unfolds and who is not troubled by that. She looked at me for what I estimate was 45 seconds. Then she turned her head just slightly to her left and looked at something in the timber beside her that I could not see from my position. Then she looked back at me. Then she stepped back into the trees. 3 steps, and she was gone, the timber closing around her without a sound, the snow falling across the space where she had been, as if she had never occupied it. I stood on the trail for a long time. My legs did not carry me any further down toward the trailhead because I could not make them move. I stood there, and I looked at the tree line, and I understood that I had just been assessed by something that had made a very specific decision in October about what I was and whether I could be trusted to handle what I was looking at. I understood that what I had been given, those 45 seconds at the tree line, was the result of months of accumulated evidence about my behavior in this valley, months in which I had come into the territory and moved through it and paid attention and not caused harm, and eventually left an offering at a structure that had been built with intelligence and intention. She had decided I could see her. Whether that decision was a reward or simply a threshold passed, I cannot know, but it was a decision. And that decision, made by a being in a wet snowstorm at the edge of the Hoh River Valley's old-growth timber, carrying whatever understanding she carried of what I was and what I intended, is the central fact of the past 22 years of my life. I drove home in the dark with the defroster running and the radio off. Karen was at the stove when I came in. She took one look at my face and put down the spoon she was holding. She said, "You saw it." I said I did. She held my face in both hands for a moment in the way she does when she is trying to look at what I am feeling rather than just what I am saying. Then she went back to the stove and I sat down at the kitchen table, and after a while she brought dinner and we ate together in the quiet of our house, and outside it was raining the way it rains in January in the Pacific Northwest, steadily and without apparent intention of stopping, and I was the most grateful I have ever been to be sitting exactly where I was, in an ordinary house with my ordinary wife and my ordinary dinner, carrying the impossible thing I was carrying and knowing that it was mine to carry and that I was not going to put it down. There was more to come. What I had seen in February was not the end of anything. It was, as I understand it now, the beginning of a different phase of something that had been going on in that valley for much longer than I had been part of it. And in March of 2004, the phone rang on a Tuesday evening, and it was Tom Brower, the Hoh Ranger, and his voice had the specific tightness of a man who has held a question for too long and has finally decided to ask it. He said he needed to talk to me about something he had been sitting on for a while. He asked if I was free that weekend. I said I was. He said he would rather do it in person than on the phone. I said that was fine. He said, Dale, I need to tell you what I know about that section of valley, and I need to tell you what I think has been happening and why I think you've been going back in there. I said, how long have you known I was going back in? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, since November. That conversation on the phone and the one that followed the next Saturday at a diner in Forks over 2 hours and 4 cups of coffee opened a door into a version of the story that I had only been seeing the outer surface of. Tom had been accumulating his own observations since the mid-90s, and what he told me that Saturday changed the shape of everything I had been piecing together alone. Tom Brower had started his ranger career at the Olympic in 1992, fresh out of the University of Montana with a degree in park management and a head full of the kind of textbook certainty that the field systematically dismantles. He was assigned the Hoh corridor because he was young and capable and because experienced rangers tended to request other assignments. He said that last part with a flat, deliberate delivery that made clear it was not a casual observation. The experienced rangers knew things about the Hoh that made them prefer other corridors, and the way the station managed staffing reflected that knowledge in its own quiet, institutional way. Nobody said anything directly. Nobody wrote anything down. They just arranged their preferences and left the corridor to whoever was new enough not to have preferences yet. His first significant encounter had been in the fall of '94, about 2 years into his assignment. He was doing a solo patrol on the upper end of the trail when he came across a section of forest about 300 meters off trail, where roughly 30 young Sitka spruce had been twisted at the base, each one broken at a height of about 5 feet, all falling in the same direction. Not a windstorm damage pattern. Wind throws trees in the direction the wind is moving, and the pattern is chaotic with trees down at varying heights and angles. These had been systematically broken, each one individually at a consistent height. The species selectivity alone suggested intention because the larger and older cedars in the same area had been left untouched. Whether the breaking was territorial marking, structural material gathering, or some form of signaling that Tom did not have the context to interpret, he could not say. What he could say was that no natural process and no human activity could produce that pattern in that kind of timber. He said he had reported it to his supervisor at the time, a veteran ranger named Bob Gustafson, and Bob had nodded and said he would note it in the log, and that had been the end of it. Except that Tom had started keeping his own log after that, and in 11 years the log had grown to fill 4 composition notebooks that he kept in a fireproof box in his garage at home. And nobody from the Park Service had ever seen it, and he had been carrying those 4 notebooks around like a weight he was never able to put down. He showed me the notebooks at the diner, not all of it, but enough. Dates, locations, descriptions, measurements, where he had been able to take them. Track documentation going back to '96, including 3 sets that predated the tracks I had found in February of 2003, and that showed the same individual based on track geometry, revisiting the same sections of the valley over multiple years. Sketches of structures, including one that matched the structure I had been visiting since April, drawn from his own observation in the summer of '99, which meant that particular structure had been in use or maintained for at least 5 years before I first found it. Notes on vocalization events which he had experienced many more times than me by virtue of spending considerably more hours in that valley, and observations made from distance and carefully documented of figures at the tree line in conditions of low light. He had counted over 11 years 17 separate instances of visual contact, none of them long, none of them close enough to resolve the kind of detail I had seen in February, but 17 across 11 years by a careful observer with binoculars and the discipline to hold still and note what he saw before he moved. 17 times in the same section of valley, the same general range of miles 8 to 12, the same pattern of the forest going quiet before the contact and returning to normal after. What he told me connects to what happened in that valley over the subsequent months in ways that I will explain in the second part of this account, because Tom had not been the only one paying attention, and the valley had not been holding only one secret, and the being I had watched step back into the timber on that February morning had not been alone in that step. The shape she had looked at, the one to her left in the timber, just inside the tree line where the snow had still been heavy enough to obscure detail, had been smaller than her, but upright in the same posture, with the same stillness. I had registered it peripherally and filed it as a shadow until I was halfway down the trail. It was not a shadow. It was young. And the look she had given it before she looked back at me had been the look of a mother showing a child something that the child was not yet old enough to fully understand, but that she had decided was time to begin understanding. Whatever I was to her, whatever category she had placed me in after watching me move through her valley for over a year, she had decided it was time for that category to be shared. And Tom, in that diner and forks with his 4 composition notebooks spread between our coffee cups, was about to tell me why the timing of that decision was not coincidental and why the valley had been waiting for something very specific to happen before the boundary between what it held and what I could see was allowed to move. Tom Brower had been carrying the second part of what he knew for 11 years by the time he sat across from me at that diner in Forks, and the specific reason he had chosen to carry it alone, without filing it formally, without telling his supervisors, without even telling the colleague at the next desk who he had worked alongside for 7 of those 11 years, was a story in itself. In the summer of 2001, Tom had been the first responder to a call from a trail crew supervisor about a camp they had found about a quarter-mile off the main trail in the lower end of the section I had come to know as the active zone between miles 8 and 12. The camp was not a human camp, though it occupied the same general category of being a deliberate arrangement of space for inhabitation purposes. It was a series of 4 structures interconnected by a path of compressed vegetation that ran between them, arranged in a loose arc against the base of a slope where a rocky outcrop provided natural shelter from the prevailing weather. Tom had documented the camp in his composition notebook with sketches and measurements, had taken photographs that he still had on a disc in his fireproof box at home, and had spent a long afternoon considering what to do with what he had found. He called his supervisor. He described what he had found as evidence of a large mammal den complex of undetermined species. The construction was deliberate, with signs of long-term use. His supervisor, a man named Gary Olson, who managed the Hoh district from an office in Port Angeles, had asked whether there was any evidence of human activity at the site. Tom reported no human activity, though the construction complexity was beyond anything he could attribute to known wildlife species. Olson had told him to document it and include it in the standard wildlife observation report, and that the research division would follow up. Nobody from the research division ever contacted Tom about the report. When he checked the system 3 months later, the entry was present, but had been reclassified as an unverified observation with no follow-up action required, a designation that in the Park Service's filing system meant it would receive no further attention. Tom had accepted this for about a week and then had stopped accepting it, quietly and without any official action, by simply continuing to document what he saw and keeping the documentation at home rather than in a system that would file it in a category from which it would never be retrieved. He had been doing this alone for 2 years before I first talked to him in that autumn conversation in 2003. And the reason he had reached out to me, the reason he had called on a Tuesday evening in February of 2004 and asked if we could talk, was not because my presence in the valley had changed anything about his accumulation of observations. It was because of what he had seen 3 weeks before he called me. He had been doing a solo patrol on a January afternoon, working the section between miles 9 and 11 in snowshoes, because the valley floor was under 8 inches of snow from a storm system that had moved through the previous week. He had reached the area around mile 10 when the forest went quiet in the pattern he had learned over 11 years to recognize as a specific kind of quiet, distinct from the general hush of heavy snowfall, more absolute and more intentional. He had stopped and held still, and he had watched the tree line on the upslope side of the trail, and he had seen in the gray afternoon light, at a distance he estimated at 60 meters, 3 figures at the edge of the timber, 2 large, 1 significantly smaller. He described the scene to me at that diner table, and his voice did not shake, because Tom Brower was not a man whose voice shook, but there was a particular flatness in his delivery that I recognized as the sound of someone reporting what they have processed until the emotional surface has worn off, and what remains is only the plain fact. 3 figures, 2 adults, 1 juvenile. Standing at the tree line in broad daylight, visible for approximately a minute before the smaller one moved back into the timber and the 2 larger ones followed. He had not seen 3 in the same sighting before. In 11 years of documentation, his visual contacts had been single individuals, always. This was the first time he had seen what could only be described as a family group present at the tree line at the same time, and it had happened 3 weeks before he called me, which was 3 weeks after my encounter with the 2 of them in February. The sequence was not lost on either of us. I had seen her and the young one in late February. In mid-January, Tom had seen 2 adults and a juvenile at mile 10, which was about a mile and a half further up the valley from where I had made contact. The January sighting had preceded my February encounter, which put a different frame on the February morning than I had been carrying. She had not been showing me the young one for the first time. She had already been visible with the young one in January to a different observer. The threshold had been crossed before I got there. The valley's relationship with human observation had changed, and it had changed at the start of that year, and I did not yet know why. I spent the drive home from Forks working through what Tom had told me, layering it against my own timeline. October 8th, 2003, the encounter with Donald Webb at the illegal camp. That was the event that felt to me like the pivot, the specific moment from which everything that followed had a different character. She had been at that tree line. She had seen what happened. She had seen me lying to Janet Flores afterward, or at least she had seen me not bringing anyone back into that clearing with urgent law enforcement intent, which from the outside would have been functionally indistinguishable from protection. Whether she had the interpretive framework to understand what official documentation was or what a law enforcement report meant, I cannot claim to know. What I can say is that whatever she read from my subsequent behavior, from my continued solo returns to the valley, from the offering I left at the structure, from the fact that I came alone and came quietly and came without weapons drawn and without other people, produced a change. The change was evident in Tom's January sighting and in my February encounter, and it was about to become more evident still. In April of 2004, I went back to the valley with Tom for the first time. We had talked about this possibility for weeks before deciding to do it, and the decision carried weight because it represented a change in the terms of what had been happening. I had been a solitary presence in that valley, which appeared to be a condition that the inhabitants were comfortable with. Introducing a second person was a variable I could not predict the effect of, and Tom could not predict it either. But Tom had 11 years of his own history in that corridor, and whatever assessment had been made of his presence over those years had apparently resolved favorably, given that he had been shown a family group in January. The argument for going in together was that the 2 of us together represented a different kind of signal than either of us alone, not a search party, not law enforcement. 2 people who had been behaving consistently in the same space for extended periods and who had both responded to what they saw by protecting it rather than reporting it. We went in on a Saturday in early April. The snowshoes were done for the season, and the valley floor was in that specific April condition that the Hoh produces every spring, where the runoff from the snowmelt at elevation has the river up and turbid, and the trail edges are soft, and the ferns are coming in green and thick, and the moss on the Sitka spruce is the brightest it will be all year, that particular yellow-green that belongs exclusively to wet Pacific Northwest spring. We walked without urgency, talking occasionally in normal tones. Not the conspicuous quiet of searches trying not to alert a subject, just two people walking in the forest in the morning. We reached the area around mile 8.5 by mid-morning and sat for a while on a fallen log at the river's edge. The Roosevelt elk were visible across the river in a meadow, a cow group of 7 with 2 calves from the previous spring still accompanying them. The river between us and the meadow was running fast and high, maybe 40 feet wide, and considerably too deep and fast to cross without a boat. We watched the elk for about 20 minutes and talked in low voices about what Tom had put in his notebooks and what I had put in mine, comparing observations and finding the places where our separate records confirmed each other's data points. Then the forest went quiet. Both of us registered it at the same moment, without needing to signal to each other. We had both lived with this pattern long enough that the recognition was immediate. Tom's hand moved to his camera and then stopped. He looked at me. I shook my head, barely. No camera yet. Let whatever was going to happen, happen. Nothing happened for perhaps 5 minutes. Then, from the timber about 80 meters upslope, a vocalization. I had heard this sound many times by then, and Tom had heard it far more, but there was a quality to it that morning that was different from the recorded instances in my memory. It was softer, not quieter in volume exactly, but gentler, the same words spoken with entirely different intent depending on how the speaker shapes it. Tom exhaled slowly through his nose. I sat still. A second sound answered from further upslope, shorter and higher in pitch, and I recognized the pitch profile from the February morning, the younger one. The same frequency range I had heard when she turned her head and looked into the timber beside her, and the smaller shape had been visible at the edge of my peripheral vision. Tom heard the second sound, and his expression shifted into the closest thing to surprise that Tom Brower's face produced. He leaned toward me and said very quietly, "That's new." I asked what he meant. "In 11 years I've heard the adults and 1 or 2 others at a distance. I've never heard a juvenile vocalize directly toward a human position." The phrasing had the quality of someone still assembling meaning as the words came out. We sat on that log for another 40 minutes. The vocalizations came 5 more times in total from different positions, suggesting movement through the timber above us, always upslope, always at a distance that maintained a buffer between the timber and our position at the river edge. Never close enough for visual contact, but present clearly and purposefully present, not surveillance exactly, more like accompaniment. We were being walked with. Whatever was in those trees was not avoiding us and was not approaching. It was simply in the same general space, occupying the same morning, aware of us and not troubled by that awareness. On the walk out, Tom said, "You know what this reminds me of?" I told him I had no idea. When you're trying to gain the trust of a very shy dog, you don't look at it directly, you don't reach for it, you just be present in the same space and let it decide on its own timeline when it wants to be closer. I told him the analogy was both apt and inadequate. He agreed. Whatever was in that valley was not a dog, he added, and comparing it to one was not doing justice to what it was. But the behavioral principle, the willingness to be present without requiring anything in return, seemed to be the correct approach. Everything we had done that was working had been a version of that same principle. The spring visits continued, always the 2 of us, always on Tom's days off and my personal days, always into the same section of valley. We established a pattern that was consistent enough to count on. Enter in the morning, walk to mile 8 or 9, sit for a period at the river or at the tree line edge, and exit before dark. We did not go to the structure anymore. I had stopped visiting the structure after my solo contact in February, an instinct I could not fully explain except that going there felt like opening a door that I had already been invited through, and that knocking again was unnecessary. The exchanges at the structure had served their purpose. Whatever relationship had been established through the gifts and the marking on the bone had reached a plateau, and the next development needed to come from the other direction. In May of 2004, we had a visit to the valley that I want to describe in some detail, because it established a pattern that would persist through every subsequent visit for the following decade. We had gone in on a Saturday, one of those Pacific Northwest spring mornings where the overnight rain has given way to a thin clearing light and every surface in the forest is wet and refracting. The moss was brilliant in that way. It gets after rain, the kind of green that looks painted, and the Hoh River was running high and cold with snowmelt from the upper drainages, carrying the gray-green color that glacial runoff gives to water in this range. We reached mile 9 and made our usual stop at the riverbank. The Roosevelt elk were not in the meadow across the river that morning, which was unusual enough that Tom mentioned it. The herd had been using that meadow consistently for about 3 years, he noted, and its absence from its usual morning grazing position was a signal worth noting. I agreed. We sat and waited, letting the forest do what it was going to do without our assistance. After about 20 minutes, during which we talked occasionally in low voices about a case I was working and a trail erosion project Tom was trying to get funded, the quality of the forest around us changed. Not the full silence of prior encounters, but a softening as if someone had turned a dial rather than a switch. The birds did not stop. The river did not change. The particular overlay of small sounds that makes an old-growth forest sound like a living organism just grew quieter in the register where a very large, very careful presence would be making noise if it were moving. I had learned to trust this particular signal more than the full silence. The full silence came when the forest was adjusting to a presence that had arrived suddenly, a rapid withdrawal of sound as the smaller animals registered the presence before they could assess it. The softening came when the presence was familiar enough that the adjustment was gradual, the smaller animals processing the approach through their normal decision-making rather than triggering a blanket alarm. It meant whatever was moving through the timber above us had been in that vicinity enough times that it registered on the forest's nervous system as a presence between safe and unknown. Worth noting, but not worth panicking over, Tom said very quietly without looking at the timber above us. Upslope about 60 meters moving south, he was reading it from the birds from the specific pattern of which species were calling and which had gone quiet in which direction, a skill he had developed over 11 years that I was still working to match. I held still and let his navigation guide my attention. About 3 minutes after he spoke from a position roughly consistent with what he had described, there was a vocalization, short, low, with the now familiar quality of directed sound, then another from a position that was further upslope and to the north, which put it approximately 100 meters back from the first. A call and a response, each from a separate individual, the exchange lasting maybe 40 seconds in total before both positions went quiet. Tom looked at me. I looked at him. We had heard the call and response pattern before, but always at greater distances, always when we were moving on the trail rather than sitting still. Sitting still at the riverbank apparently produced a different response than moving through the territory. This was new information about the parameters of whatever comfort level had developed, and we both registered it without needing to say anything. After the vocalization stopped, we waited another 30 minutes before getting up and starting back down the trail. On the way out, at approximately mile 8, we found what had become our reliable indicator that the encounter had been acknowledged. A fresh pile of material at the trail edge, just inside the tree line, too deliberate in its arrangement to be random debris, cedar bark pieces, some broad leaves, and what appeared to be a clump of elk hair, still oily and fresh. Not placed on the trail where we would have had to step over or around it, but set just inside the tree line where it was visible from the trail without blocking passage. Whatever the placement communicated, and I never achieved certainty about that, it had the character of a marking, a sign that the space had been noticed and that noticing had been returned. It came in June of 2004, and it did not come from the direction I expected. I was working a night shift, a Wednesday, and at approximately 11:15, I got a call from Tom on my personal cell phone, which I answered because Tom had never called my personal cell before, and that distinction alone told me something significant was happening. He was at the Hoh Visitor Center parking lot. He had gotten a call from a hiker who had come out of the trail earlier that evening, a man in his mid-50s from Bremerton named Fred Cook, and Fred was not in good shape when he came out. Not injured, not lost, but shaken to a degree that Tom described as beyond normal. Fred had come out of a 4-night solo trip and had been at the visitor center for about an hour before Tom had arrived for a late shift, and in that hour Fred had told the duty ranger 2 things that the duty ranger had correctly flagged as Tom's business specifically. The first was that on his 3rd night out at his camp near mile 10, he had been visited. not by a camp raid that Robert Strand had described. This was a visual contact, and unlike anything in my experience or Tom's experience up to that point, it had happened in the middle of the night in Fred Cook's headlamp beam at a distance of approximately 20 feet. He had gotten up to use the bathroom at about 2 in the morning, and when he turned on his headlamp, he had seen it standing at the far edge of his camp near the food storage pole he had set up, not at the pole, near it, not interacting with his food at all, just standing there, facing him, in the circle of his headlamp. He described, and Tom read me this section of the duty ranger's notes over the phone, a figure of enormous height, with hair so dark it was nearly black, and a face that was wide and heavy, and watching him with eyes that caught the headlamp beam and held it, the same way some animals' eyes hold light, with a reflective quality that human eyes do not have. The figure held its position for approximately 30 seconds and then stepped backward into the dark beyond his headlamp range and was gone. Fred Cook had not run. He had not made any loud noise. He had stood in the cold in his long underwear holding his headlamp and watching the space where it had been, and after a while he had gone back to his tent and lain awake until dawn, without sleeping. He had completed his trip, come out on schedule, and driven to the visitor center before calling his wife because he needed to tell someone before he got in his car, and he did not know how to tell his wife. The second thing Fred had told the duty ranger was that on his last morning in the valley hiking out, he had found an object on the trail that was not his and had not been there on his way in. A small bundle of cedar bark laid in the center of the trail at a point where a large root crossed the surface, folded into a rough package and bound with a single strip of inner bark. Inside was a piece of dried fish. He had photographed it before he touched it, and the photograph was on his phone, and Tom was looking at it while we talked. I pulled off the highway into a turnout and asked Tom to describe the photograph in detail. The package was about the size of a person's palm. The cedar bark was fresh, cut recently based on the color of the exposed material. The strip binding it was spruce root, not inner bark, as Fred had initially said. The fish inside was smoked, densely packed and dry, the texture of extended smoking. Steelhead most likely based on the coloring of the meat, and that the smoking method based on the texture he could see in the photograph was something he had not seen produced by any conventional method. I sat in my truck on the shoulder of US 101 with the lights of a logging truck going past and the sound of the Hoh River somewhere in the dark to the west, and I thought about what Tom was telling me. Fred Cook was a stranger, a day hiker who had been in that section of the valley on a solo trip and had no prior relationship with what was there, no history of evidence gathering or quiet visits or exchange of offerings. He had done nothing to establish any particular trust. He had been visited in the night and had not reacted with fear or aggression. He had completed his trip calmly, and on his way out, a gift had been placed in his path. The gift was not food left at the edge of a territory as part of an established exchange. It was placed in the center of the trail where it could not be missed, in a form that was clearly packaged rather than simply dropped. Someone had prepared it, had chosen the location, had placed it with the intention that Fred Cook would find it. I told Tom what I thought this meant. He was quiet for a while. Then, "They're not waiting anymore," he said. He meant that whatever dynamic had been operating, in which the valley's inhabitants had been the subjects of our observation and we had been the ones determining the pace of approach, had changed. The approach was now coming from the other direction, and it was coming not just to Tom and me, who had earned something over 2 years of patient behavior, but to a complete stranger who had simply been present without causing harm. The terms of engagement had expanded beyond the two of us. What was in that valley had begun reaching toward the humans who passed through it, selectively and carefully, but reaching. That realization, processed on the shoulder of a highway in the dark with a logging truck's lights fading north toward Forks, stayed with me through the rest of the summer and into the fall. I told Karen about Fred Cook's experience over dinner that same week. She listened carefully and then, "What if they've been doing this for a long time and we've just been classifying the evidence as folklore?" I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Every indigenous culture on this peninsula has traditional knowledge about beings in the mountains, the Quileute, the Hoh, the Quileute. This isn't new. What's new is 2 people in law enforcement taking field notes." She was right, and the rightness of it put the 2 years of my fieldwork into a context that made it feel larger and smaller at once than I had been treating it. Larger because the pattern extended back centuries. Smaller because whatever I had documented was a very small portion of a very long relationship. The fall of 2004 passed in the rhythm of the work. SAR missions came in, and I worked them. The office absorbed my attention through the days. On weekends, Tom and I went into the valley about once a month through September and October, and the pattern of accompanied walks continued. The vocalizations from the timber, the quality of presence that was neither avoidance nor approach, but something intermediate, a monitoring that had the texture of familiarity. We did not push. We had both internalized the lesson of the shy dog, though neither of us had said it out loud again after that April morning. Between 2005 and 2008, the visits continued with a regularity that I think of now as the long middle of the relationship, the years in which nothing dramatically new happened, but in which the accumulated weight of consistency was doing the invisible work that all trust building depends on. Tom and I went in usually twice a month in the spring and summer, and once a month in the fall and winter. We went on foot, always, never by any other means. We kept our conversations low and our movements deliberate. We kept the duration of our visits consistent, not so long that we became an imposition on whatever daily patterns the valley's inhabitants maintained, not so short that our presence was unpredictable. Consistency was the entire strategy. In the absence of language and shared culture and any of the other tools humans normally use to establish trust, the only currency available to us was behavioral predictability over time. During these years, I developed a more refined sense of the territory, a mental map built not from any official chart but from observation. The area between miles 8 and 12 of the Hoh River Trail was the active zone in every sense I had been documenting. Below mile 8, encounters were rare and brief, typically just the call and response vocalizations I had first heard in August of 2002, nothing more. Above mile 12, the terrain steepened, and the trail began climbing toward the Glacier Meadows area below Mount Olympus, and this transition seemed to coincide with a change in the pattern of evidence. Not an absence, but a different quality, as if the corridor above mile 12 was at the periphery of the range we were inside rather than the center of it. The density of sign, the track frequency, the structure locations Tom had documented in his notebooks, the pattern of tree modifications, all of these concentrated between miles 8 and 12, and specifically in a half-mile radius centered around mile 9.5, which was where the river made a specific bend against a basalt outcrop and where the transition between the more open river corridor and the heavier old-growth timber was most abrupt. I described this to Karen over dinner one evening in the spring of 2006, using a sketch I had made on the back of an envelope. She studied it for a while and then said that the concentration pattern was consistent with a core territory. The area an animal or a family group returns to consistently as its primary range, with the lower and upper extents being transitional buffer zones. She said the basalt outcrop at the bend was probably a landmark, the kind of stable, prominent feature that serves as a fixed reference point in a mental map of territory. I told her I had been thinking of it as the center for some time, without being able to say why. And she said, because that's what it is, you just didn't have the vocabulary. She brought this same quality to everything I told her about the valley, the ability to translate an observed pattern into a framework that made it make sense. And I have been grateful for it every day since we started these conversations. In the summer of 2007, I began to notice a specific change in the behavior of the elk herds in the active zone. Over the 5 years I had been observing the valley, the Roosevelt elk that used the meadow across from my usual sitting spot had established a consistent reaction pattern to whatever was in the timber. They would pause, orient, and then move steadily away from the upslope tree line when the presence became significant. This response was the one I had first noted in October of 2002, the hold and withdraw that had told me something was upslope, that the elk needed to process carefully. Roosevelt elk are not timid animals. A mature bull in the rut will stand his ground against a black bear, and cow groups with calves will form defensive circles that require a very serious threat to break. They are calibrated responders, meaning their behavior scales precisely to the level of threat they perceive. What I had been watching since 2002 was a medium-level response, the kind they produce for a known predator at uncertain range, alert but not panicked, moving away without abandoning the meadow entirely. Over 5 years, that response had been consistent whenever the forest pressure changed in the way I associated with active presence upslope. In the summer of 2007, I watched a cow group of about a dozen animals on 3 separate occasions remain grazing in the meadow while the forest on the uphill side went through the quieting pattern I associated with active presence. They did not withdraw. They paused, oriented, and then went back to grazing. I mentioned this to Tom on our next visit. He had noticed the same thing, and it matched something he had read in the track literature about animal behavior in territories where a large predator has been resident for many years. The prey species in well-established predator territories habituate to the predator's presence over time, not losing their vigilance but calibrating it, learning the difference between the predator at rest and the predator in hunting mode, and adjusting their response accordingly. If the elk had habituated to the presence in the timber to the degree of not withdrawing during low-threat situations, it indicated that the presence had been stable in that territory for a period of years long enough to establish a recognizable pattern in the elk's behavioral repertoire. Not months, years, possibly generations. I chewed on that for a while. The implication was that whatever I had been documenting since 2002 had been present in that section of the Hoh Valley for long enough to have become part of the ecosystem's calibration. Not a recent arrival, not a transient, a resident in the fullest ecological sense of the word. Karen, when I told her, said, "That's what the indigenous accounts reflect. They describe a long-standing cohabitation, not a recent incursion." She had been doing her own reading in parallel with mine, working through the ethnographic literature on the Hoh, Quileute, and Kinoa peoples and their traditional accounts of the beings they shared this territory with. The Quileute have a word for them that translates roughly as the wild ones of the forest, which is not a term of fear. It is a term of taxonomic description. They exist in the traditional knowledge of these peoples as a category of being, as real and as specific as elk or cedar, requiring the same respect and the same understanding of territory and behavior. They are not supernatural in the Quileute tradition. They are natural, thoroughly and unambiguously natural, and the accounts of encounters in that tradition have the same practical, observational quality as accounts of bear encounters or weather patterns. The strangeness is ours, not theirs. The beings in that valley are strange only to people who have organized their understanding of the world around a set of assumptions about what can exist in it, assumptions that the Hoh people never made and that the valley has been quietly contradicting for a very long time. In November of 2004, during a search for a pair of day hikers who had gone off trail in the lower valley and gotten turned around in the dark, Tom was running one of the teams. At approximately 7 in the evening, while working the tree line on the east slope, 2 of Tom's volunteers had heard something moving in the timber above them and had held position while Tom investigated the perimeter. He found at the base of a large spruce just inside the tree line a small cairn of river stones, 3 flat pieces of basalt stacked in a deliberate column, still damp as if they had been placed there within the past hour. The stones were from the river, which was a quarter-mile away. Someone had carried them up to the tree line and stacked them during an active search operation in the dark while 8 people were moving through the forest below. Tom photographed the cairn and said nothing to his team. He came to me the following day and showed me the picture. We both understood what it represented. The search had been visible from the timber, loud with radio traffic and headlamps sweeping the understory. And in the middle of it, at the edge of the tree line, a marker had been placed. Not a territorial warning, not an aggressive display, a presence acknowledging a presence here too. That cairn photograph went into Tom's composition notebooks, and it went into my own notes that night, and when I wrote it down, I sat for a long time afterward thinking about what it meant that a being in the forest would choose to mark its presence during a human emergency operation, not to interfere, not to help, but simply to be acknowledged in return for the acknowledgement it was extending. It was, as far as I could interpret it, the most explicitly communicative action in 2 years of accumulated evidence. It was the equivalent of raising a hand. The search found the missing hikers at 9:40 that evening, hypothermic but alive, sheltering in a drainage about a mile from where they had left the trail. Standard outcome for a competent search in manageable terrain, and I was grateful for it in the ordinary way. but my mind was on the cairn all the way through the debrief and the drive home. I want to describe a specific visit from the fall of 2010 because it sits in my memory differently from most of the others. Not because anything unusual happened, but because of what did not happen and what the absence communicated. We had gone in on a Saturday in early October, a wet morning with low clouds sitting at about 1,000 feet and the forest operating at that particular dim green level that October produces in the Hoh when the rain has been heavy and the light cannot find its way through the cloud canopy combination above. We reached mile 9, sat at the river, waited. An hour went by with none of the signals we had learned to read. The forest was quiet in its ordinary way, not the specific quiet of presence, just the ambient quiet of a wet October morning, with the river running loud and the smaller sounds of the forest muffled by moisture. Nothing at the tree line, no vocalizations, nothing at the trail edge on the walkout. We had been visiting for 6 years, and in that time, we had not had a completely blank visit. Something had always indicated that our presence was noted, even on the visits where the indication was subtle. Just a slight change in the bird activity or the smell on a specific section of trail, or the sense of the forest's atmospheric pressure shifting in the pattern I had learned to read as acknowledgement. This visit produced nothing. We walked out in the rain talking about whether Tom's proposed trail erosion project would get the budget approval he had applied for, and I did not say what I was thinking, which was that I did not know how to interpret the blank. On the drive home, I thought through possible explanations. Seasonal movement, which was a possibility, particularly in October, when the elk herds shifted their ranges in response to the rut and the accompanying behavioral changes in the forest dynamics. Extended ranging, possibly. Weather effects on the acoustic signature we relied on to detect presence. None of these satisfied me fully. What I kept coming back to was a simpler possibility, that the beings in that valley had their own interior lives, their own preoccupations and needs and events, and that on any given Saturday in October, those interior lives might simply not have any part of them turned toward us. That the valley's relationship with us had reached a point of sufficiency, a level of established mutual awareness that did not require constant maintenance the way a friendship of long standing does not require daily contact to remain real. The blank visit was not a withdrawal. It was the ordinary rhythm of a relationship that had become normal. That framing made me feel better than I had expected it to. It suggested a kind of normality about what we had been building that the more dramatic visits did not. The first sighting, the exchange at the structure, the cairn in the searchlight, the smoked fish on Fred Cook's trail, these were all significant because they were new. The blank October visit was significant because it was ordinary. Ordinary meant durable. It meant that whatever we had established was sturdy enough to absorb a day of nothing and remain. I thought about that drive home for a long time after. There is a particular loneliness in caring about something that you cannot talk about, and I had been carrying it for 8 years by that point. The people I worked with every day, good people, competent investigators, men and women I trusted with my professional life, would have had no framework for what I was doing on my personal days. I had developed a full repertoire of half-truths for the purpose. Hiking with a buddy from the Park Service, doing some field work on Roosevelt elk behavior, getting outdoors before the weather closed in. None of it was exactly false. All of it omitted the part that mattered. I had become genuinely skilled at having a double interior life, which is a thing that law enforcement people sometimes develop anyway, carrying the weight of what they see on the job away from the people at home. I was just carrying something different from what most of my colleagues were carrying. Karen was the one anchor. She knew the full truth, and she had known it for years, and she treated it with the same precise attention she gave to everything she cared about, which meant she took it seriously without being consumed by it. She asked good questions when I had new information to share. She did not press when I didn't. She kept the obsidian tool on the shelf without calling attention to it when her colleagues visited, and she cataloged the medicinal plants I brought home with the same care she gave to her botany curriculum. That steadiness was what made the whole enterprise survivable. Without it, I think the isolation would have bent me in directions I would not have recovered from cleanly. I retired from the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office in June of 2015. 30 years in, a clean exit, a pension that paid adequately, and the freedom to do what I wanted with my time, which turned out to be a combination of the things you might predict: woodworking, gardening, taking Karen to the coast for weekends, and the things you might not, which was going into the Hoh Valley on my own schedule without the constraints of a work calendar. Tom had retired from the Park Service 2 years before me in 2013, and we had begun going into the valley together more regularly once neither of us had a workday to return to by a certain hour. In the years between Tom's retirement and my own, the visits had taken on a quality I can only describe as companionable. We walked in together, we sat at the river, we listened to what the valley offered, and we walked out. Occasionally there was a detail to note, and we noted it. Occasionally there was nothing, and we walked out and talked about other things. The fear that had been present in the early years, the particular alertness that comes with not knowing what you are in the vicinity of, had left so gradually that I cannot identify the visit on which it was finally absent. It simply was not there anymore. What replaced it was not complacency, but the ease of a place you know well enough that you stop bracing for it and start inhabiting it. I had been retired for about 8 months when Karen came with us for the first time. She had been willing to hear about every visit for 12 years and had provided the biological and cultural context that made the observations intelligible, and she had never asked to come along. She waited until I had been retired long enough to demonstrate that I was going to keep going and that the activity was not about the job anymore, but about the place and the relationship itself. And then one morning over coffee in February of 2016, she said, "I think I'd like to see the valley." I told her it was cold in February. She told me she had been a Pacific Northwest girl her whole life, and she knew what cold meant, and would I please take her to the valley. We went the following Saturday, Tom and Karen and I. Tom was gentle with her in the way he is gentle with all people he respects, giving her the briefing about what to expect and what not to expect, the behavioral signals, the patience required, the possibility that nothing significant would happen. Karen listened to all of this with the attention she had always given to incoming information about the valley, precise and cataloging. On the walk-in, she asked questions, and Tom answered them with the specificity of 11 years plus of direct observation, and by the time we reached mile 9, I had the feeling that these two people, both of them scientists in their own ways, were going to be useful to each other beyond what I had expected. Nothing significant happened that day. We sat at the river for an hour, walked to mile 10, came back. The forest offered its ambient self, rain and moss and the smell of the river and the sound of it. No particular quiet and no particular presence. But Karen noticed things I had stopped noticing years ago. She pointed out near mile 8.5 that the big leaf maple on the upslope side of the trail had an unusual proportion of broken branch stubs at a consistent height, about 14 feet up, along a stretch of maybe 200 meters, not storm damage, which would be irregular, a consistent height, consistent direction of break, the same limb diameter each time. I had walked past those trees dozens of times and had filed them as a general feature of old-growth maple, the kind of thing that accumulates over decades of weather events. Karen had been in the forest for 3 hours, and she had seen a pattern in it that I had missed entirely. She did not make a big statement about it. She just took a photograph and wrote something in the small notebook she had brought, and I watched her do it and felt something I can only describe as gratitude for having married someone who paid attention. On the drive home, Karen was quiet with the same quality I recognized from the early conversations about the valley. She was processing. She was filing the day against everything she had read and heard and building a new data layer from direct observation. That night she told me the thing she had noticed most was the smell on the approach to mile 9. She had a trained nose from years of teaching plant identification, and she said there was a scent in that section of the trail that she could not attribute to any known plant species in the Pacific Northwest botanical record, a warm, complex, animal-adjacent scent that overlaid the rain and bark smell of the rest of the valley, and that she had not found in any prior experience of that terrain. She said it was not a distressing smell. She said the opposite, that it had a quality she would describe as grounding, a density and warmth that produced a physical settling in her chest the way certain frequencies of sound produce physical resonance. She said she understood for the first time why the accounts of encounters consistently described the smell as one of the most distinctive elements. She had expected it to be unpleasant. It was not. I told her Fred Cook had used the word calming. She said that was accurate. She said she thought the scent was probably pheromonal in character, a chemical signal that conveyed information about the emitter to other members of the same species and possibly to other species in the territory, and that the specific effect it produced in her was an artifact of the biological proximity between our species and theirs, a shared olfactory processing channel from the common ancestry that still showed up in both lineages despite hundreds of thousands of years of divergence. She said it as a hypothesis, carefully, in the way she always generated hypotheses. I told her it was the best explanation I had encountered. She said, "It's probably still wrong in the specifics, but right in the general direction." That is how she thinks about science, and it is one of the things I love most about her. The relationship with what was in the valley had evolved over the years between 2004 and my retirement, and I want to describe it accurately, because accuracy matters here more than impressiveness. There were no dramatic developments, no fireside conversations or extended face-to-face encounters or moments of obvious mutual recognition that I could point to and say, that was the day everything changed. What there was instead was a very gradual closing of a distance that had been held constant for years. The vocalizations from the timber that had always come from upslope began incrementally to come from positions that were closer to our trailside locations. The periods of the forest's particular quiet that preceded and followed our sightings of movement at the tree line became over several years shorter, as if whatever anticipation or caution had generated that specific silence was diminishing. The gifts on the trail, which Fred Cook's experience had introduced as a new element in the pattern, continued. We found them about a dozen times over the next decade, always in the same section of valley, always small, always practical: smoked fish, dried berries, once a bundle of plants that Karen, when I brought them home, identified as all having documented medicinal properties, including anti-inflammatory and analgesic compounds. Once, in the spring of 2009, I found a piece of worked obsidian, a small tool roughly 3 inches long with a flaked edge on one side that was sharp enough to shave with. I gave that to Karen, who keeps it on a shelf in her study above her botany books. The visual contacts in this period were infrequent and brief but consistent. I had direct sightings, by which I mean periods of 30 seconds or more where I could see the figure clearly enough to distinguish features on 4 separate occasions between 2004 and my retirement. Tom had 3 of his own that he logged with the same precision he had applied to everything else in those notebooks. In every case, the contact was at the tree line in the same general section of valley, and in every case it ended when the figure chose to step back into the timber, not in response to any action on our part, but on its own timetable. The 4th of my direct sightings in September of 2012 was the one that changed the texture of everything that had come before. Not because it was longer or closer or more dramatic, because of what I saw. I was in the valley alone on a Thursday. Tom was at his daughter's place in Olympia for the week. It was a clear afternoon in early September, the kind of afternoon the Hoh produces about 2 weeks a year, when the cloud cover breaks and the valley is full of slanted autumn light that turns the moss and the ferns a gold green that belongs to no other place on earth. I was sitting on the log Tom and I had made our usual rest point at the river's edge near mile 9, eating an apple and watching the water when the forest went quiet. She was at the tree line within about 30 seconds of the quiet starting. 50 meters as usual at the edge of the old-growth timber, where the canopy makes a clear boundary with the more open corridor along the river. I had learned by this point not to look directly at the tree line when the quiet started, to look at the water or the ground for a period before slowly raising my eyes, which seemed to reduce whatever process of assessment was preceding the contact. I let a full minute pass before I looked toward the timber. She was there, the same individual I had been seeing at that tree line for 9 years. I had learned her size and her posture well enough by that point that I would have recognized her in far worse conditions. But beside her, and this was the part that stopped my breath more than any previous contact had managed, was a second figure, about 2/3 her height. Upright still, with the same quality of composed attention that I had come to associate with her specifically. The hair was lighter in color than hers, the near black of her body hair contrasting with what on the younger figure was a dark brown that was closer to the color of old cedar bark. The younger figure's features were less resolved at that distance, but the proportions were right, consistent with the juvenile I had seen peripherally in February of 2004, now 8 years older and visibly grown, but still noticeably younger than her in the way that young animals carry their youth in the set of their bodies even before size fully establishes it. She was showing me the young one again, not peripherally, this time, directly. Standing beside her at the tree line in good light with the full September afternoon falling across them both. I sat on my log and I held still and I breathed slowly and I let myself look, really look, at two beings who were standing at the edge of their world and looking back at me across the boundary that separated ours. The young one moved first after about 40 seconds, a single step backward, which was enough to put the tree trunk between herself and my line of sight. Then she stepped back out, curiosity apparently overcoming whatever caution had produced the step back. She looked at me with dark eyes that were sharper than her mother's, brighter and more actively scanning, a quality that reminded me of nothing so much as a very intelligent teenager, checking to see if the adult is really as safe as she's been told. I did not move. I did not speak. I sat on my log with my apple in my lap, and I was as still as I could make myself. The young one took a step forward, then stopped, then looked at her mother. Her mother had not moved. The young one looked back at me, took another step forward, which put her out of the shelter of the tree trunk and into the open at the tree line, no longer partially obscured, fully visible in the September light at a distance I now estimated at closer to 40 meters. I could see her face clearly, broad, with the pronounced brow that I had associated with the adults in this population, but softer in its lines than the adult version, the features not yet fully set, still carrying the roundness of something in its growth phase. Her eyes were watching me with an undisguised quality that I can only call open. She was not performing caution. She was genuinely curious and had decided in the way that young things decide things to follow the curiosity rather than suppress it. She stood at the tree line for approximately 2 minutes. I sat on my log. After the first minute, I spoke in the same quiet conversational tone I had used in the snowstorm in 2004. I said, "Good afternoon," which is a sentence I am aware sounds ridiculous in the context of this account, and which I delivered without any expectation that the words themselves communicated anything. The tone and the intention were what I had. The young one's head tilted slightly to the right, and one hand came up to rest against the tree trunk beside her, a gesture so human in its unconsciousness that it put a pressure behind my eyes I was not expecting. Then the mother made a sound, low and brief, and the young one stepped back into the timber. A moment later, the mother followed. They were gone. I sat on my log for a long time after. The river ran beside me, and the light moved on the water, and the moss on the maple branches above me was brilliant and wet in the afternoon sun, and I thought about what it means to be trusted by something that has every reason not to trust. To be extended a contact across a gap most people would say cannot be bridged, and find that the extension arrives anyway, tentatively, with one hand on a tree trunk, because curiosity is apparently stronger than caution in both directions. Tom, when I told him that Saturday on the phone, was quiet for a long time. Then he said he had been waiting for something like this. I asked what he meant. He said, "In 11 years before you started coming in, I never saw a juvenile during daylight at the tree line. In the 12 years since, I've seen them twice, both times with an adult who was clearly deciding to allow it. You changed things when you came in." I said I didn't think I had changed anything, that I had just been present and consistent. He said, "That's what change looks like." Karen read my notes from that September afternoon over dinner. She did not say anything for a while. Then she said, "She's teaching her." I said, "I know." She said, "She's teaching her that you're safe, that the ones who come back quietly and don't bring others and leave things at the structure and don't raise their voices, those ones can be looked at." I told her I thought that was exactly right. She said, "Think about how long that takes. Think about how much patience that requires." I told her I had been thinking about it for 9 years. She said, "I know. I'm just saying it out loud so it's real." It was real. It had been real for a long time. Putting it into words just let us sit with the realness together for a while. I want to return, before I close this account, to October 8th, 2003. Not to revisit the encounter with Donald Webb, which I have described fully, but to address the period that followed it, specifically about the question I have been carrying since that afternoon and have never been able to answer definitively. There is a section of the Olympic National Park backcountry where the rules that govern ordinary wildlife management do not appear to apply in the expected ways. The Park Service knows this, in the specific manner that institutions know things they cannot officially acknowledge through the behavior of experienced personnel, through the informal pattern of staffing assignments, through the reclassification of field reports into categories from which they are never retrieved. Tom's formal report about the den complex was not the only one. He found two others in the system, both filed by different ranges over a period of years, both reclassified in the same way. The data is there. It is just organized so that it cannot accumulate into a conclusion that the institution is not prepared to reach. I have never filed any report about what I have witnessed in that valley. The decision I made on October 8, 2003, when I told Janet Flores that Donald Webb had already left before I arrived, was the first such decision, and it established a precedent that I have maintained without exception for 22 years. I am a man who spent his career in law enforcement, and the tension between what that career represents and the choice I have been making is not one I can fully resolve. What I can say is that I made the choice on the basis of a specific judgment about consequences, a judgment that has been reinforced by everything I have learned in the years since. What is in that valley cannot be protected by any legal framework currently in existence because it cannot be officially acknowledged to exist. The only protection available is the protection of silence, and the beings who live in that valley have been depending on that silence from every human who has known about them and chosen to keep the knowledge from the Hoh and Quileute, people who built their relationship with this territory over centuries and encoded their knowledge in oral tradition that was never designed to be filed in a ranger station log. To Tom Brower with his 4 composition notebooks in a fireproof box, to me with my waterproof field notes and my 30-year career in law enforcement and my kitchen table in Port Townsend where I have been putting all of it into words for the past 3 weeks. The question I cannot answer is this. Did she know when she intervened on October 8th that the man with the rifle was a threat to me specifically? Or was she responding to the general dynamic of a high-tension confrontation at close range? Did she know me in any meaningful sense from my months of presence in her valley? Or was the intervention simply what her presence always produced when it was made visible, a reordering of the situation that had nothing to do with me in particular? I have turned this question over thousands of times, and I cannot land it definitively on either side. What I know is the outcome. She appeared, and the man with the rifle left, and I walked out of that clearing and drove home to Karen and ate dinner, and am here, 22 years later, putting it into words. The why behind the outcome is not mine to resolve from the outside of it. I can only report the facts as I observed them and leave the interpretation to whoever is willing to sit with it. Tom retired to a property he and his wife bought outside Quilcene, about 20 miles east of Forks, with a view of Hood Canal and the hills above it. He goes into the Hoh 2 or 3 times a year still, alone or with me, and he keeps his composition notebooks in the fireproof box. He has not numbered them past 4. He said he has been waiting for a reason to start a 5th, and that what I am doing now is that reason. He called me last month and said he was on his way to the office supply store. Karen retired from teaching 5 years ago and has applied her considerable scientific mind to the problem of the valley in the way she applies it to everything, systematically and without sentimentality. She has cross-referenced my field notes with the published literature on unclassified primate populations and with what she could find of the historical record of indigenous accounts from the Peninsula. She believes, and I agree with her, that what is in that valley is not confined to that valley. The Olympic Range has over 900,000 acres of national parkland and additional wilderness areas adjoining it, and the corridor from the Hoh northward through the Quileute and Quileute drainages and east toward the Hood Canal watershed represents a connected territory of hundreds of square miles of deep wilderness that has never been systematically surveyed at ground level for signs of an intelligent bipedal hominid, because the scientific establishment that would authorize such a survey does not officially acknowledge that there is anything to survey for. The absence of evidence produced by the absence of investigation is not evidence of absence. It is the absence of investigation. What I observed in that valley from the first elk herd holding position in the rain in October of 2002 to the young figure with one hand on a tree trunk in the September light of 2012 to the gift on Fred Cook's trail and the cairn in Tom's headlamp and the marked bone that I left on my kitchen counter and Karen looked at and understood is the edge of a pattern much larger than what I can see from where I stand. I know this. I have always known it. The evidence I have accumulated is a small cross-section of a pattern that extends across time and terrain and the full, complicated history of the human relationship with this land. I am one observer in a very long line of observers who chose silence over exposure, and I am breaking that silence now, not because the time for silence is over, but because the time for acknowledgement has arrived, at least within these words, which go no further than you. There's one more thing. On a Sunday morning last spring, I was in the valley alone. Tom had a medical appointment, nothing serious, a routine follow-up. I went in by myself the way I had been going in for years, comfortable with the solitude and with the specific quality of attention that solo time in that timber produces. I was at the river edge near mile 9, sitting on the same fallen log when the forest went quiet. The quiet is different now than it was in the early years. Less abrupt, less absolute, more like a change in a conversation's register than the suspension of all sound. It has become familiar beyond what the word familiar can hold. I looked toward the tree line after a minute. She was there, at the same position, the same distance, the same composed stillness, and beside her, the young one, who was not young anymore in any sense that the word usually implies. 21 years old, if I have the timeline right, which means she had been a juvenile when I first registered her presence peripherally on a February morning, and had grown through the years of her development while Tom and I walked in and out of the valley and left gifts and cataloged sounds and made the specific choices that we made about what to file and what to keep in composition notebooks at home. She was nearly as tall as her mother now. The lighter coloring of her hair was still distinguishable from the near black of the older figures, though the difference was subtler than it had been in September of 2012. She stood at the tree line with the same quality of stillness as her mother, but her eyes were on me with a directness that her mother's eyes had never had. That active, scanning quality I had noticed in 2012, still present and undimmed, still reading whatever I was, with the particular intensity of a young intelligence that has not yet decided how much of the world it can take at face value. She took a step forward. Not the tentative step of 12 years ago with one hand on the trunk for the option of retreat. A deliberate step into the open, both hands at her sides, weight fully forward, facing me across the 40 meters with nothing between us. She stood there. I sat on my log. The river ran beside me. The Sitka spruce were 70 feet overhead. The moss on the branches was the deep spring green of April, and the light was soft and gray the way it always is in the Hoh, filtered through cloud and canopy both, and she stood at the edge of her world, and I sat at the edge of mine, and we looked at each other across whatever distance still remained between those two edges, and I thought about 30 years of mornings in this valley and 22 years since October 8th, and the man with the rifle, and the blowdown pile, and the 4 seconds that had rearranged everything, and I thought about Karen at the stove saying you saw it, and Tom with his notebooks, and Fred Cook, and the smoked fish in the cedar bark package, and the marked bone on the kitchen counter, and the obsidian tool on the shelf above the botany books, and the cairn of river stones in the November dark, and the young one's hand on the tree trunk in the September light. She looked at me for about a minute, then she turned and stepped back into the timber, and her mother followed, and the forest held its particular silence for a little while longer before the birds came back and the dripping resumed and the river went on past me the way it has gone past everything that has ever stood on its banks for 10,000 years. I sat on the log for a long time after, not because I was unable to move, but because I wanted to stay in the specific feeling of that moment for as long as it lasted, the feeling of having been looked at fully and found acceptable by a being that had every right to withhold that acceptance and had chosen not to. That choice is worth sitting with. That choice is worth whatever words I have spent on this account and whatever discomfort this account produces in whoever reads it, and whatever risk comes with putting my name to a claim that law enforcement and scientific convention and institutional memory have worked together for decades to keep out of any official record. I served 30 years with the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office, and I am telling you what I saw as completely and as accurately as I know how to tell it. There is a being in the Hoh River valley of the Olympic Peninsula who stepped out of the timber on a Sunday morning last April and looked at me for 60 seconds from 40 meters away, and she has been watching this valley her whole life, and her mother has been watching it for longer, and whatever the word is for what they do, out there in the old-growth timber of one of the wettest places in the lower 48, in the drainages that no road enters and no trail maintainer visits and no satellite image resolves below the canopy, it is not hiding, it is living. It has always been living, and the distance between that living and our own is considerably smaller than the map suggests. I drove home on US 101 with the windows down, the spring air off the Hoh coming through the cab, and by the time I reached the turn for Forks, I was thinking about dinner and whether the garden needed water and whether Karen had remembered to call the insurance company about the car. Ordinary things, the most ordinary thoughts in the world. And underneath them, held in the same space where I hold the things that matter, the memory of a face at a tree line in April light, and a pair of eyes reading whatever I was and deciding one more time that I was worth looking at. That is enough. After 22 years, that is more than enough. That is everything.